Well, we are continuing in our Lenten series, going through Philippians and what we call the descent and the ascent of Christ. And let me begin this morning. It's just an observation on my part, and I'll leave it to you to decide whether or not you think it's a coincidence or what. But there has been a shift in America. You would have to have really lived in another country not to have figured it out. But we used to be one of the great manufacturing nations in the world. And as I have watched over my lifespan, especially in the last couple of decades, there's been a major shift from being producers to us being consumers. And it has literally, I think, this transition has bled into every single part of our lives. Whether we're aware of it or not, consciously or unconsciously, it's there. And it seems to me that there's always, no matter what the scenario is, whatever the situation is, that there's always a kind of a question hanging in the air. And here it is. What have you done for me lately? What have you done for me lately? The attitude of Jesus was so different than our attitude for a lot of reasons, but one of those reasons was that Jesus was absolutely so secure in who he was and whose he was. And probably we could use a ton of passages for that, but there's probably one that speaks to me about that better than any of the rest, and it comes to us from John 13:3. And I remember the first time I read this, it's just like it just leaped up off the page at me. And here it is. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things into his hands, and that he had come from God, and that he was returning to God. Now, if that doesn't grab you, and it might not, and I understand that, let me just tell you the truth from my perspective. My entire security is wrapped up in that verse. I mean, if I know that I come from God, and I mean everything that I have comes from God. Not just my existence, but my mind, my body, my abilities, my talents. Everything I have comes from God. I come from God. And if I know that I'm returning to God, not just that I know that I will dwell in eternity with God, and that even though I die in the flesh, I live in the Spirit for eternity, it's more than that. I'm returning to God everything that I've been given from God. That's the whole point of my existence, that I come from God. I'm returning to God. That's my life. If I know that, if you know that, if we know that, we can be faithfully secure in who we are and whose we are. And you know what? That'll compose you. That'll absolutely free you and define you. And here's the other end of it. If we are secure, we will be humble. And you can just take the counter of that and understand what I'm saying. Insecure people cannot be humble. They can't afford to. C.K. Chesterton, who was this giant, and I literally mean it physically, of a Catholic theologian, he weighed about 300 pounds, made this statement. It is always, he says, not sometimes, not maybe, not a few times, he said it is always the secure who are hungry. And so it's that all-encompassing power of security that Jesus lived in that literally explains the intentional courage it took from him to let go of all of his heavenly privileges. And as the NIV says, made himself nothing, taking on the form of a servant, being made in human likeness. All of those actions prove to me that Jesus came to this earth with no self-agenda. He had nothing to prove, nothing to protect, and nothing to lose. And see, that kind of power can define any kind of circumstance that you and I are going to face that could potentially create insecurity in us. It's not just me that thinks that. It's not just Jesus that thinks that. Paul himself concluded that, and really at the end of Philippians, that the text that we've been using or will use through this Lenten series. If you get towards the 4th chapter and about the 10th verse, Paul makes this sort of epiphany that he shares with the church at Philippi. He says, I've learned the secret. He said, I've learned the secret of being content in whatever situation I find myself. And what he's saying is, it doesn't really matter whether I'm rich or I'm dead dog broke. It doesn't matter whether I'm full or whether I'm empty. It doesn't matter whether I have everything or I have nothing. I can do all things through him who gives me strength. He knew who he was and whose he was. But I want to go back to that John 13:3 verse. Because it was in that secure knowledge that Jesus had the certainty of knowing that he had come from God and that he was returning to God, that all of a sudden, when the meal was over, he gets up, he takes off his outer clothing, he puts a towel around his waist, and he gets a basin and fills it with water, and he begins to kneel down and wash the feet of every single one of those disciples, including Judas. Washing feet was a job for a servant, for the host of the house. This wasn't Jesus' house. There were 12 other disciples in there. Not one of them ever for a moment considered washing anybody's feet. But Jesus, knowing that he'd come from God and that he was going to return to God, got up and washed every single one of their feet.